For our online folks, please put your comments and your questions, use your chat feature and your Q&A feature online so that I'll be monitoring those over here on the side, and we'll be shooting those out as well, and so that you feel like you're engaged in the conversation. For our in-person folks, first thing that's always on the top of my list, restrooms are out to the left, down the hall to the left, and they're just across the hall from the elevator and the stairs. So that's important. And then we'll also have a Q&A time. I'll have the microphone. I might solicit somebody to help me with that. But if you have questions, raise your hand. We'll get the microphone to you, because we want to hear your conversation as well, right? We want to hear your voices in this space. Then, sorry, I've got contact issues going on here. So I think we're just going to get started. This is a conversation, like I said, that is well overdue. So I just want to introduce Bishop Gregory von Palmer. He is the resident bishop for the West Ohio Conference of the United Methodist Church. And it has been under his leadership that about 8 years ago, he walked out of Chillicothe Correctional Institution, convicted that the church has a role and a responsibility in helping men and women return from incarceration safely and wholly. And that's a responsibility we take very, very seriously through our conference, and I know many of you do as well. But today, he's bringing his curiosity and his learning about the generational impact that violence and mass incarceration is having within the lives of our community members and in our country as a whole. So he comes not as an educator, but as an eager student of justice.
Amen. Amen.
And so I ask that you please welcome him warmly, and then he will welcome our guest who is coming to us from New York.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and for the kind and generous introduction, for being with all of you, and for whatever little bit of vision I had. I am dependent upon other people that pick up my little raggedy ideas. They find the kernel in them and they run with them. And Reba Collins is one of those. Any of you that have worked with her know that. Amen. And I'm looking around Dee Stickley Minor in her previous role in our office as Director of Connectional Ministries, is really chiefly responsible for getting Reba here and engaged with the West Ohio Conference and all of the partnerships that the two of them have helped us to nourish, and I say help us to flourish in this good work. So thank you one and all for being here online, in person, etc. And I know it takes a whole bunch to make something like this happen. So thank you for all the effort that you've gone to. And if you're a part of sort of the infrastructure, we're grateful to you as well. We don't want to lose a lot of time with a lot of introductions, and we want to turn to Danielle as soon as we can. And so thank you again for your presence here. And I just love this idea of ongoing, eager curiosity. And I want you to know, about a year and a half ago, I asked Reba to recommend some reading to me. I then got a 2-page email, and it was several books, but she actually sort of really summarized them in a paragraph in a wonderful way, just like she was a book. Have you been a book reviewer in your previous life? And it was just wonderful. But one of those was Until We Reckon. So if you've not read this, I did not know of Ms. Sered, did not know of the book, and may have at a distance heard of Common Justice. So if you don't have this, I do encourage you, along with Reba, to avail yourself of it. And if not today, you know it is in some digital versions as well. It is well worth your time. It will rock your world, and it will undermine your assumptions. Amen? And we get better when our world is rocked and our assumptive world is turned upside down, so that we can see things right side up and whole again. So now is our distinguished guest with us, and she's coming on. And we're grateful to you. Thank you for being with us today. We're grateful for your time. And I'm Gregory Palmer, and we've got a wide audience, and that's already been described to you in emails. And I want to say I only have one regret, Ms. Sered. I still naively brought my book thinking I was going to get a signature today. And then I remembered that it was online in that regard. So again, thank you. And we have come to know through your vita and through your writings of your work through Common Justice and work that you did before that. And we've read your bio, but tell us a little bit more why this has become vocation and life passion for you. And then give us a little background on Common Justice so that we can see it as well.
Thank you so much. It appears the video may be substantially delayed.
Yeah,
Hello?
I think you're right.
Hello? Can you hear me?
Yeah, you sound fabulous.
So it looks like the video, I'm watching a video of myself in the recent past, I think checking emails before you called me on.
Do we need to hit pause for any tech challenge?
I wonder if there might be a way to reset it.
Yeah, I don't know. Peter, you have a refresh her browser? Okay. Belltree Productions is suggesting you refresh your browser.
Great.
Okay.
I'm patient.
Let's just take a pause for the cause. And while she's doing that, you know, how opportune that we are doing this in the acknowledgement, and I want to say the celebration of Reentry Month, and our acknowledging returning citizens, especially in this week. One of the things that in Reba's mentioning a visit that I had to Chillicothe Prison is as I listened to the brothers there saying to me, and particularly those that said they had strong relationships with faith-based communities, mostly churches, but not exclusively, that almost the hardest point of reentry was when they walked into a religious or faith-based gathering and people moved their seat. And that's really where the conviction sat in, that one inmate at that time said to me, he said, I returned to a church where my father was the pastor and where the people knew me. And when I slid in the back pew, 3 people moved over to the right. And so that's a part of that, that conviction. That's only one slice, one angle. But where else should there be receptivity except in living faith communities, whether churches, synagogues, mosques, etc., given all that we say is core to us in receiving and welcoming people. And coming alongside of them, I want to use the words, you don't need to preach, I'm trying to kill time. Are we back online yet? All right, I see you moving. We can't hear you, are you? But this time
Let's
I do see your mouth.
Can you hear me now? It still appears delayed, I think.
Yeah, we're getting better. We just leaped 90%.
We're getting closer.
Yeah.
What would you like to do? Do you want to start talking while I mean, it's a little distracting for everybody, but if
It's
you
a
want to
little
start.
distracting, but let's hear from you. We'll get it. Go right ahead.
All right. So we can go ahead and begin. Do you want me to keep, to the tech folks, do you want me to keep my video on? Oh, maybe that reset's about to happen. Look at that. That's just my picture now. Thank you so much for your gathering. Thank you for inviting me to join you virtually. It's an honor to be among you in this way today. And there are many things about these last years that have been so hard, but I do feel grateful to this part of technology that allows us to be in more places together than we might have known how to do many years ago. So thank you again for the invitation and for your really beautiful words, Bishop, and that you said we're killing time, but we're really bringing that time to life.
Were you continuing to say
No,
a
I'm
little
happy.
bit.
If you wanted to start off our conversation with whatever
Okay, so
questions you want to
the
offer, I'm
first
ready.
question was, say just a bit, not so much from the resume, but mind and heart about why this is life's work and vocation for you, and then help us to see common justice. Just give us a thumbnail sketch of what the bullseye is for common justice.
I'm happy to. So I grew up in Chicago. I came of age in the late 80s and early 90s, alongside mass incarceration. We were both small at the same time and grew big at the same time. Um, I witnessed an enormous amount of violence. I survived violence. Loved ones of mine survived violence. I lost people I loved to murder. And I also watched mass incarcerations regain its strength. I watched people go away. Most people were too ashamed to say where their loved ones had gone, so we just said they went down south or they were away for a minute. And I watched people come back, almost always worse for where they had been. And it really helped shape my belief that prison is a place that I don't know that if we had a contest to design somewhere that extinguishes in us our fundamental human capacity for empathy, I don't know that you could design something better than a prison. And the fact that so many people emerge from those prisons with their capacity for empathy still intact is not a credit to the prison. It is a credit to the human spirit and the things that even in the worst conditions we can survive and protect in ourselves. But I also know at that time that the levels of incarceration we were beginning to embrace as a nation were being done in the name of survivors, including survivors like myself. And I started to pay attention to my own experience, to the experience of survivors around me. And I found first that far fewer of us actually wanted prison than was being reflected in the public dialogue. And that even the people who got prison for the people who hurt them were never healed by it, not once. So in all the sociological literature, all the psychological literature, there is not a single study that correlates the length of a defendant's sentence to a victim's healing. Not one. And yet we continue to say we exact these sentences and those names. And so we should be very direct that we are not doing that for safety. We are not doing it for healing. We are doing it for revenge. And we are doing it for a desire for revenge that very often is not in a victim's heart or doesn't remain there for terribly long. And so as a culture, we have prioritized revenge over safety, revenge over resources we could spend on something else, and revenge over the real needs of survivors and their healing. And at the same time that I was experiencing violence as a survivor and seeing this, I was also doing foolish things because I was an adolescent who'd survived trauma, and adolescents who survive trauma do foolish things. And in the criminal legal system, I was met with an enormous amount of mercy, where the Black and brown men with whom I had done many of those foolish things were met with nothing but the most punitive spirit imaginable. And so I came to understand the racial disparities in the criminal legal system as someone who benefited from them. And I understood at that time that it would be my job to find people who were fighting those disparities and to join with them in that fight until we won or I died, whichever came first. And so I've been in that fight ever since. But I also understand myself as someone who is in the fight to eradicate violence. And the truth is that if you hate violence, you come to hate incarceration. And you do that because prisons are places that not only embody and concentrate violence, but generate more and more of it. The core causes of violence are structural. They're things like poverty and inequity and poor social service and educational and medical infrastructure. But on the individual level, the core drivers of violence are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. And the core features of prison are shame, isolation, exposure to violence, and an inability to meet one's economic needs. So we've baked into our core responses to violence exactly the things that generate them. As somebody who wanted to survive, who wanted the people I loved to survive, I became undeterringly committed to developing solutions to violence that actually worked. And common justice does that. We provide an alternative to incarceration based in restorative justice processes, where in cases like assaults, robberies, burglaries, stabbings, shootings, gunpoint robberies, with the consent of both the prosecutor and the survivor themselves, people come together into a dialogue where they reach agreements about how the responsible person can make things as right as possible. If the person completes those agreements and goes through our violence intervention program, they graduate from the program, the felony charges against them are dismissed, and they don't serve time. And in the meantime, we provide wraparound services to the people who were harmed to help them come through what happened to them and in their lives generally. And so I often say I became a prison abolitionist as a violence abolitionist, right? Like if you look to the sources of violence in our country, you look for the things that generate it and you seek to eradicate those. And when we're being honest, we learn that prison is one of the things that generates violence. And so as we reduce our use of it, we become safer in this generation and the generations to come.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And you were talking around solutions, and roughly around page 14 in the book, Until We Reckon, you talk about resistance to solutions, barriers to solutions around mass incarceration, violence, et cetera, and that you say the barriers are not what we think they are to getting to creative and healing redemptive solutions. They are more about the stories or the story we tell ourselves. Say more about how we have narrated ourselves out of redemption and healing.
So there are many, many things that work to keep us safe. I mean, the first things, I think if everyone in the room took a moment and imagine a time that you felt safe. Think about where you were, who you were with, how it smelled, what the temperature was in the room. And I would venture to say not a single one of you imagined a circumstance that involved prisons or police. When we imagine our own safety, when we experience it in relationship. We experience it in the arms or homes of people we love, with our parents, with our children, with our elders, with our neighbors who care for us when our own blood families can't. We experience safety and connection and relationship. And that's always been true. We keep one another safe. Prison fundamentally, like indisputably, is made of isolation and separation. Even in the best facilities they are characterized by separation, by the severing of exactly the things that bring us to relationship. And then there are countless programs that work to make people safer. There are violence interruption programs, there are after school programs, educational programs, restorative justice programs. We know what to do to make each other safer. But in this country, we have long told a story about who commits violence. And the story is as old and as racist as our nation. It is a story about some imagined monstrous other, someone who is so different from us that they're incapable of empathy as in the way we would be, and from whom we have to be protected at any cost to our budgets, any cost to our values, that all of those things go out the window in the name of protection from this monster. And because we are America, the image we conjure of that monster is almost always that of a Black man. We have always racialized the story of violence in this country. And so in drawing on that long-standing racialized narrative, we build prisons instead of roads, and prisons instead of schools, and prisons instead of hospitals, and prisons instead of all of the very things that would actually keep us safe. Whereas if instead we understood that there are people among us who cause harm, that if someone causes harm, they do so for a reason, that they are almost always themselves a survivor of harm, and that while that does not excuse for a moment an ounce of what they did, it does give us insight into what we might do to help transform that behavior. If we believed people who cause harm, that when we hurt people, we owe an obligation. And that obligation is not to suffer in a cage somewhere, but rather to contribute to the repair of what we broke, to fix what we rent apart, and be part of the solution of making things right with those we harmed. That if we were to imagine that instead, if it was a story in which everyone is possessed of human dignity, in which everyone makes mistakes of different levels of consequence, in which each of us are accountable for every one of our mistakes, but where accountability requires and calls on and nourishes our human dignity. It calls us to do more rather than less, not to be diminished and controlled, but to be enlarged by the burden that we have brought on ourselves to be in better and sounder relationship with others. We could build a world in which violence is uncommon. We could build a world in which cycles of violence halt and they're interrupted not by enforcement, but by healing and accountability. Those things are within reach to us, but until we come for the fundamental story that has underpinned our vicious punitiveness as a nation, we will never choose the solutions that are and have always been before us.
So you talked about the racialization of otherness in this most recent response, and the image that many people conjure up of a black male in particular, black people more broadly speaking. As we become more racially, ethnically diverse in the United States, i.e. more people of color that are here, have been here, are immigrating here, do you see that racialization extending to other groups of, let me use the word BIPOC people in your work and your research?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's important to note, the first people who suffered from racialized violence in this country were Indigenous people, and Indigenous
Absolutely.
people remain among some of the most overrepresented people in our criminal legal system. We extend that racialized narrative to include Latinx people, to include people from the Muslim people from the Middle East, right? We're capable, our racism is broad reaching and expansive and continues to grow. And still the heart of the United States involves a black and white binary, right? It's the question is how close are you to black and versus how close are you to white? And people will position themselves along that, like by choice, to try and secure their safety and the safety of others. And people will be positioned along that spectrum by systems that seek to oppress them. So absolutely, people of color generally in this country have always fared worse in any systems than white people. And you see those disparities everywhere in the criminal legal system, but you see them in our schools, you see them in our hospitals. Like you see the difference in third grade reading levels, you see the difference in COVID deaths, you see the difference everywhere you go. And so those disparities have long been baked into who we are as a nation. And I often think the most important question we face as a nation is whether or not we want to transform that. Like whether we actually want to be a truly representative democracy, whether we want to account for and repair the historical harm we have caused and stop causing that harm or not. I think it's the most central debate in America. And it masquerades as debates about crime or education or any number of things. But fundamentally, in many ways, we are still answering the questions that were at the heart of the Civil War.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Earlier on, you mentioned that there were no studies, I thought I heard you say, that seek to look as to whether or not there is any correlation between, let's say, the punitive response to crime and violence and the healing of people who are victims of violence or their family. I know I'm rehearsing it roughly as you said it. Is common justice, is anybody proposing, seeking a Lilly grant or whatever to do such a study? Is there any of that work projected?
The reason so what I'm indicating is there is no proven correlation between the length of a longer sentence doesn't bring more healing. No study will ever prove it. It doesn't, that's not how healing works. We are not healed by someone else's suffering. And I don't say that as a moral judgment, as somebody who has survived rape and domestic violence, as somebody who has lost loved ones to murder. I carry no judgment in my heart for people who would want to see the people who hurt them suffer. I have certainly wanted that for many of the people who have hurt me. And there are some of the people where I am still working through the last vestiges of in my heart that still find the idea of them suffering to feel valuable to me, right? But what I know is that another person's suffering will not heal me. It just doesn't work that way. Like if you go to the doctor with a pain in your back, the doctor can't just pull somebody in and twist up their back and you walk out strengthened by it. If somebody hits you with a bat and you have a broken arm, you can't just hit their arm with a bat and be able to move again. Like physiologically, we are not healed by someone else's suffering. We are healed by healing. And so there is no reason to believe that the length of a sentence would actually heal us. That doesn't mean that in the moment of sentencing, that some victims and their families do not feel a sense of gratification at that time. Many do, and many don't. Most victims' families will tell you that if you are talking about a case of a homicide, there is no number that will ever satisfy that pain. There's nothing that matches it in a sentence. And even when those numbers are the maximum, they're the highest we can imagine. There are sentences that are in lifetimes, and there are even sentences to death. Even those sentences do not relieve the pain of that loss, because those sentences do not return people to us. They do not relieve our trauma. They don't change the conditions that put us and our loved ones at risk of being hurt in the first place. They don't give us power to generate meaning and value out of what happened to us. All they do is guarantee to us that someone else is suffering too. And while that's normal to want, it turns out it's not enough. And one of the things when I was writing the book, I did a Freedom of Information Act request and got a number of the statements that survivors have made to parole boards. And I've accompanied a number of survivors to parole boards. I've accompanied people seeking parole to parole boards. I'm familiar with those, but I tried to look at a broader view than just those I'd seen. And so many of those statements involve survivors saying, I feel the same way I did on the day this happened. Shame on us. Because one thing healed people don't feel is the same. We are not fully at peace. We don't stop being sad, but we evolve. We become capable of joy as well as sadness. We find that our muscles to love people come back in time and are not, in fact, totally eliminated from us by the loss. We see ourselves and our loved ones and the world differently over time as we heal through it. And so the notion that someone would say that I feel the exact same way, and our takeaway is that we should keep doing the exact same thing. We should just add 10 more years onto the sentence. We should say, come back to the board in 4 years. Doesn't make any sense. If you went to your doctor and you had terrible migraines, and every 2 years you went back and said, my migraines are the same or worse. They feel the same way they did the day I came to you. And your doctor just renewed your prescription. You would eventually decide that you were getting poor medical care, right? You would seek something else. And so I find in some ways the enduring pain of survivors, even survivors whose cases has resulted in someone's incarceration, to be among the most damning evidence of the criminal legal system's inefficacy for us all.
Yeah. So you've written and spoken about our understanding of and our approach, particularly perhaps for faith-based people, to the notion of mercy, second chances, new lease on life kind of thing. And you've opined that our mercy, so to speak, that approach doesn't go far enough, deeply enough. Say more about that.
So I think mercy is of enormous importance. And it's mostly important for those of us who are exercising it, right? In the same way, the people who benefit most from forgiveness are those of us who do the forgiving, because it releases us from our attachment to someone else's suffering, and that gives us room to do something else with that energy, like heal and love and move forward with our lives. I'll say two things about mercy. One is I think we make the mistake in thinking that in order to support something like alternatives to incarceration or sentencing reform or any of that, that we have to be merciful. And we don't. We only have to be pragmatic. There are two things survivors can't stand. We can't stand the idea of going through what we went through again. And we can't stand the idea of someone else going through what we went through. And so when we're faced with choices, we choose the things that we think will prevent the things that we cannot stand. 90% of survivors who are offered the decision to see the person who hurt them in common justice or incarcerated, 90% choose common justice. Only a fragment of that 90% do so because of mercy. Many survivors do it because they know prison will not work to deliver their safety. If prison worked, we would be the safest nation in all of human history, and survivors would not have been hurt in the first place. As survivors, we pay the price of prison's failure with our enduring pain, and we know it. We have seen people go away and see that the neighborhood doesn't become safer. We see people come back worse for where they have been. We still live where we live. Our neighbors are still who they are. Like, we know that incarceration will not deliver us into safety. It doesn't work that way. And when we take a risk on something else, and it's not because we love risk taking. It's not because we hate mass incarceration even. It's because we want to be safe, and we discern accurately that the things before us will not make us safe. And so many of our survivors are not merciful. And I don't know that I think pragmatism is less beautiful than mercy, right? I don't think that they have to be merciful. I think we can take our whole lives to find our way to mercy as survivors if that's what it takes for us. I don't think we're obligated to get there at any pace that has anything to do with the criminal legal system. And I don't think we as a people have to all share a sense of mercy in order to make different decisions about our criminal justice policy. We could actually do it just because we decide we're going to choose what works. That said, I do love mercy. I love mercy because I think that any of us who exercise power have an obligation to do that in a way that affirms and uplifts and makes possible the best in the human dignity of the people before us. And that mercy is a choice to do that. But mercy alone, I don't think constitutes justice. I think to constitute justice, we need mercy on the part of the people who hold the power to give or withhold punishment. Whether that's a judge in the specific case, a group of legislatures, the public who the legislators listen to, right? Those of us with that power have to exert some degree of mercy, grounded in our humility, that but for the grace of God, we could have sat in any of those seats in the courtroom. But I also think to really make justice, those of us who have caused harm have to take accountability. And accountability is not the same as punishment. Punishment is passive. Punishment is something someone does to me. Accountability is active. To be accountable, I have to acknowledge what I've done, acknowledge its impact, express genuine remorse, make things as right as possible, ideally in a way defined by those harmed, and become someone who will not cause that harm ever again. Accountability is some of the hardest work any of us will ever do. But if, as the person who has caused harm, I do that labor, the labor to reconnect myself to my community, to those I've harmed, to mend the pain that I have caused, to anchor in my own human dignity in a way that reflects the best of the world around me. If I do that, and those with power meet me with mercy, then together we can make justice.
Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous. So let me ask a question. I hadn't planned on asking this, and certainly not in this way. Back to the punitive approach as opposed to a restorative approach. Do you have a sense, a conviction that, let's say in our culture here in America, we actually have an addiction to punitiveness rather than a commitment to restoration? And if so, to what extent is that addiction driven by the economics of incarceration and the violence-producing industry?
I think it's a great question. I would go even further, that it's not just that we have an addiction to punishment at the expense of a commitment to restoration. We have an addiction to punishment at the expense of basic pragmatism and safety, right? So even put aside what it would look like for us to choose transformation over degradation of people who've caused harm. What if we just said our criminal justice policy is going to be dictated by what produces safety? Our responses to violence will only be things that we can reasonably expect will reduce violence. That seems very reasonable to say responses to violence should be things that reduce violence. That is not the going standard in this country for how we respond to harm, right? The responses to harm is that responses to harm will be ones that satisfy somebody's desire for revenge. It's fine to want revenge. As an individual person to long for that almost all of us at some stage of our healing processes find the notion of revenge satisfying, right? Like it's a normal human response. The fact that it's a normal human response doesn't mean that we codify that into every last one of our laws, even when codifying it makes us less safe. Even when prisons have been proven over and over again to be criminogenic, meaning when we put people in, people are more rather than less likely to commit more harm. Even when over and over again we learn the intergenerational effect of incarcerating people's loved ones, the effect it has on the people left behind and the detriment people experience. Like even when the economic trade-offs are so vast that there is not a school we could not make extraordinary, not a hospital we could not make cutting edge, not a public health infrastructure we could not make into something that could have handled COVID in months instead of years. Right? We could do any of that if we wanted to. In New York City, the annual police budget is $13 billion. $13 billion every year. Give me $13 billion once, and I swear to you, you will see better outcomes than you see. Give it to me repeatedly every year. Give it to us, to our movement, to keep one another safe. There is nothing we couldn't do. And the only thing we have to do to have that world is to decide that we are not going to make revenge the single most important, non-negotiable value of our culture. We have to say we are willing to let go of the pleasure we associate with revenge so that we can live in a world where people's needs are met, where people don't get hurt, where violence rarely occurs. That's all we have to do. We have to let go of that. And I think that desire for punitiveness is undoubtedly, I don't know that it's driven by the economic interests. I think the economic interests benefit immensely from it. I think they reinforce it at every turn. I think they contribute to popular narrative, media, culture that codify and reinforce and, make that desire for revenge extra sexy. I think that desire for punitiveness, I think there's something natural in us. Like I do think there's a point in each of us where when we're hurt, revenge sounds nice. But I think we've interwoven it in this country with our deep-seated racism. And it becomes an amalgam of what would otherwise be a passing human feeling, and instead becomes this intractable, braided hate, right? Where the dehumanization of people of color intertwines with the part of revenge that is dehumanizing of the other. And they reinforce each other to the point that we hold that more sacred than we hold each other's human lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I've got two more and then we'll shift the atmosphere and get our panel up here. Can you articulate in a way that helps us to distinguish effectively so that we can articulate the distinction between revenge and accountability? Because I think there are some well-meaning people, at least in their own minds, that are sort of stuck there. And can you help us at all with that?
I think the same way I would say sort of in what I shared about punishment versus accountability, I would conflate revenge and punishment. Mm-hmm. Right? And so punishment we do to somebody. It requires nothing of me to be punished. Accountability requires everything of me. My acknowledgement of what I've done, my acknowledgement of my impact, my expression of remorse, making right in a way that people I've harmed get to define, which is not a thing that ever happens in the criminal justice system. And the hardest labor any of us do, which is becoming someone who will never hurt anyone ever again, right? And so revenge is something we do to people who have caused harm, and accountability is something that people who have caused harm can do. You can't actually hold anyone accountable. We hold ourselves accountable. We are accountable. We talk at Common Justice. Someone many years ago, I was running a program for young men coming home from Rikers, and one of our participants came up to me and he said, "Ms. Danielle, you're always talking about accountability. What does that really mean?" And for a second, I thought this was a trick. I was like, is it my birthday? Because there's nothing I wanted more than some 17-year-old to ask me to define accountability. But it was a real question. And I was hurried that day and a little like cranky. And so I gave a really fast answer. And I said, accountability is doing sorry, which is still how we talk about it at Common Justice. Not saying sorry, feeling sorry, being sorry, doing sorry, right? What does that look like? Like, what does sorry look like as a set of actions toward the person you hurt in your community, in your life, with yourself when you're alone, toward your family? Like, how does one do sorry? And I think for many survivors, if the people who hurt us feel sorry, for some of us that matters, and for many of us it doesn't. And someone saying sorry can be nice, and also it sometimes feels really small compared to our pain, hard to trust, and without watching their action. But when someone does sorry, when somebody listens to us, when we tell them what they have to do to make it right, and they do that, they do the things that are for us, that are for the community, that are for themselves. We see them become people who won't hurt anyone ever again. That starts to be worth something. And it's worth more than punishment ever will be to us. I remember when I was living in Atlanta, one of my mentors, one of my elders and mentors, this woman, Miss Annie, was very terribly robbed and beaten. And unlike most survivors, she called the police. And unlike most survivors, she went through grand jury and all of that, like all of those first legal processes. And unlike most survivors, the case went to trial. Only 2% of cases go to trial. Hers did. And it resulted in a conviction. And unlike most cases, the person was sentenced to the max. And for the most part, she was treated with respect by law enforcement and the prosecutor throughout, which is also an uncommon experience, especially for Black women. And so all in all, it was the criminal justice system at its best, right? Like that's as good as it gets. Like this is an ace. This is the best win they're going to get. And I remember asking her, and I said, respectfully, after he was sentenced, meaning the person who had hurt her, I said, did you feel relief? And she said, of course, baby. And I said, and how long did that relief last? And she said, at least 3 or 4 hours. And she said, but then I took the bus home and I got off the bus and the neighborhood was still dangerous. And I got into my apartment and I was still poor. And I went to sleep and I still couldn't sleep. And when I finally slept, I still had the same nightmares. And when I woke up, my body still hurt in the same way. And the one thing that was different was that I couldn't stop thinking about that boy's mother's face because her face is also my face.
My God. Yeah.
And Miss Annie is both exceptional and not. She's an exceptional human being. Like I'm blessed to have had her in my life. But I've heard a version of Miss Annie's stories 1,000 times more than I've ever heard anybody say. The criminal legal process and the sentencing of the person who hurt me gave me what I need. I have met thousands of survivors and have yet to meet one who would say that. And so in the face of that overwhelming evidence that what we are doing is harming so many and benefiting no one, how do we do anything other than try something else? And I don't mean that politically. I don't even mean it logically. I mean it morally. Like, how do we do anything other than something new?
Wow. Thank you. So many people come to this work, not all people, and we need all of us doing this work that you've described, but many come out of their faith orientation, convictions, etc. At the core of the teaching of their faith tradition are words like love, forgiveness, redemption, transformation. When those faith traditions are at their best, do faith communities and faith-based people, when they're at their best, have anything out of their core, practices, disciplines, habits, ways of seeing this work particularly around forgiveness, that we need to be doing more of or articulating better?
I mean, I do. There are days where I say I'm going to stop talking to anyone except people of faith about this work, because the things you describe, those are the values that are going to anchor the world we fight to become, right? And so there is such an important contribution of people who are anchored in those values to help move each and every one of us to it, both in large groups and individually, in relationship and congregation and all of that. It's just, this is a culture change project more than a policy project, right? And so that culture changes and it changes in relationship. And I think one of the things I think is really important is that I think it's really important we not pressure people to forgive. We let people do that in their own way, on their own time, understand it as deeply personal and as a thing that, when it is true, cannot be rushed. I think we offer spaciousness for people to define what forgiveness means to them, what part is theirs to forgive and what is God's, and allow people to sort of call that balance differently in a way that is true and right for them. I think we can affirm everything a person deserves as someone who is hurt, as compatible with their forgiveness, that including letting people be furious, letting people have their time of wanting revenge before moving to something else, letting people be and breathe in those times of brokenness for as much and as long as they need to, and hold them with love as they start to heal through it, and be there for the transformation as it comes. I think communities of faith can and have to welcome formerly incarcerated people into their congregations with dignity and pride, not secrecy. I think communities of faith have to acknowledge that there is not a single one of us that has not caused harm. Some of us, the harm we caused may not have been illegal, but that didn't make it right. And ground us in our shared humility as we think about others who have caused harm. I think sometimes when our righteousness can become judgment, when in fact the most righteous among us are always truly the most humble. And I think, I always say I have mixed feelings about when I hear there's going to be a Christian position on things. I have mixed feelings because it can go a lot of ways. But if I hear there's going to be a Christ-like position, I feel very good. And so to also really understand, like, we are called, when we are called on to be righteous, we are called on to be the best that people can be, to be the most humble, the least judgmental, the most compassionate, the most hopeful, most patient, with ourselves and with one another. And I think when faith communities can steer into that place at our hearts, that there are very few other groups of people who can do more to help move our culture in a direction that not only we might be proud of, but where we all might actually stand a chance of surviving.
Well, thank you. As we transition to our panel, let's give Danielle some love today.
And thank you all for your patience with the video and all of it.
My name is Zach Ruppel, and I have the honor of serving as the National Policy Director for Just Leadership USA, and I'm a volunteer with the Central Ohio Restored Citizens Collaborative. I first came to Danielle's work in a restorative justice course that I'm taking from the Vermont Law School, and it was one of the few books in the last 5 years that I have devoured as quickly as what I did. And I kept sending Rena on the panel over here screenshots, and I said, we got to talk about this, we got to talk about this, we got to talk about this. And then I called Reba, and I said, could we do a thing for Reentry Week? And here we are. And so I want to thank Reba and the West Ohio Conference as a whole, as well as all of the presenting partners, for making this a reality. My hope is that your head and your heart are full that this has been challenging, it has been provocative, and it will lead to lasting change in Central Ohio for our community, because I know that we all share the common value of wanting to be safe, wanting to belong, and wanting to heal. So I am joined on stage here with three experts in each of their own rights, and I want to introduce them to you. My friend Rena Shack with the City of Columbus, the Director of the Office of Violence Prevention, Mr. Dana Brock with Impact Community Action, and Ms. Lorena Lacey with the Whitehall City Attorney's Office Victim Advocate. So it is National Reentry Week, and so we're going to start framing our time together here by going right to some reentry-like applications of what we've heard already today. So we're going to start with you, Dana. And I'm curious, you and I have walked somewhat similar paths, both going from being directly impacted to now working in reentry services. And we talk a lot about the journey from reentry to reintegration. We talk about innovations in community supervision. We talk about encouraging folks, enabling folks, making sure that they have what they need. Where do you see in Central Ohio and in general opportunities for our reentry services and the pursuit of reintegration to be more restorative?
So I think that, first of all, thank you all for having me here. It's truly a pleasure. First of all, I think that one of the biggest things that I have, one of the biggest obstacles I faced when returning home was housing stability and job opportunities. And I think that that's still at this point, because I returned home in 2018, I still think now here in 2023, that is still very much a prevalent obstacle for individuals returning home. And so I think that where we could really maximize our efforts in reentry is coming up with ways to help support long-term, short-term housing stability for individuals returning home from incarceration. I've heard whispers of a program or an initiative called master leasing, and I'm not really a fan of that term, but it is a program or an initiative that kind of works with property owners, property managers to help get these individuals into an opportunity to get housing, get supportive housing, and become accountable for that housing through a process of some months that would help them, probably a first month free, second month half rent, third month full rent. And I think that that's something that our city and individuals who make these policies should really get behind, because I think that something my apostle always talks to me about, and something that I heard Danielle say in so many words, is once you restore the value, you can reduce the violence. And so I think that that's going to be key when it comes to how we reimagine reentry and the opportunities that we can take to help make this transition for individuals a lot more smoother and seamless, and to help them be successful in that transition. Expanding our partnerships throughout the city with employers and other organizations to incentivize employers to take that chance on individuals returning home from incarceration, and expanding our workforce development programs to not only be centered towards vocational trades like construction, manufacturing, and things like that, but to also venture into the business realm. We have a lot of people during my incarceration who were very creative, very smart, but made a bad choice. And because of that, they don't have the opportunity to live in that purpose. And so I think that that's going to be key, and a wonderful way that we could grasp onto some opportunities in order to help us change. If I can, real quick, because I had the opportunity to look over this book, and then I want to quote chapter 5, where it talks about policy and power. And something that I read real quick and sitting there and listening to her really spoke out to me. And it says that the work of creating a world in which pathways to repair are the norm rather than the expectation is fundamentally the work of culture change. And I love that. It will require not just new programs or new resources, but also new ways of thinking and acting with one another. We make a grave error if we mistake policy change for culture change. Changing the law and changing hearts and minds are not the same thing. And on the whole, policy flows from culture and not the reverse, right? And so therein lies, I think, a solution when we can form partnerships between judges in the individuals who maybe come before them, partnerships with probation officers and probationers, partnership with the parole boards and formerly incarcerated, partnerships with the community and the formerly incarcerated that will foster this culture change and culture shift, which will ultimately get us over that hump.
And that they are the commonplace, not the exception.
Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Dana. I appreciate that.
Mhm.
Danielle, I'm wondering, and this is also a test to see if we are merged, both video and audio, but I'm curious in your work assisting those coming home from Rikers, where were you able to infuse restorative practices into the reintegration process for someone who may be coming home worse than what they were when they were sentenced?
How's this? Video
Oh,
and audio
wow.
together.
Oh,
Wow.
yeah.
What isn't possible? The work I did for people coming home from Rikers was not restorative. I mean, in the sense it was not restorative justice. I think of restorative justice, I think it's useful to define it narrowly, that it's a process in which the people most directly impacted by a given harm come together and reach agreements about how the responsible person can acknowledge and repair that harm.
Mm-hmm.
And so not everything that is restorative justice,
Mm-hmm.
right? And not everything that is justice is restorative justice. And I think it's helpful to define that narrowly, because otherwise we end up having a lot of things that call themselves restorative justice. And some of those things are not survivor-centered. Some of those things are not as robust, and they make people suspicious of restorative justice as a solution for serious harm because they've heard it associated with everything under the sun. In doing work with people returning from things I have done sort of on my own, because, you know, we all need hobbies. I've supported conversations with people who've returned home from prison with the people they harmed, right?
Mhm.
Like restorative dialogues. And I wouldn't even call those restorative justice because they didn't necessarily involve making agreements. They involved just speaking to each other. I think those are challenging because I think, you know, prison extracts so much from people, but it extracts the wrong thing. It's like you're paying a debt to the wrong place. And the best way I've thought about it is like, you know, you imagine that your aunt has a spare room in her house that she lets you live in, and she charges you really cheap rent for it because she needs that money to be able to make her own rent. But she charges you the least she possibly can, and you live with her, and that works for you both. And then something happens and somebody is threatening you and extorting money from you, right? And they're saying, if you don't give me $1,000, I'm going to hurt you, kill you, do these things. And so you take the money you have and you give it to those people who are extorting you. And then you can't pay your aunt, who deserves it. I think people owe a debt to the people they've hurt. And I think prisons are that extortion. Prisons extract from people so much time. They cause so much violence. They extract so much dignity. There's so much loss. It's very hard for people coming home from prison to even begin to imagine there's a greater debt they still owe. And then the debt to the person they hurt goes unresolved. And that's bad for the person who caused harm. It's bad for the person who's hurt. And so those dialogues for people coming home when they happen can be really extraordinary. But I think it's hard to understate what a detrimental effect incarceration has on those possibilities for repair.
Yeah. Thank you. I appreciate that. So we're going to go to Lorena next, who is getting a mic ready, it looks like. And so we have spoke a lot about the needs and centering the voice of the victim. And as a victim advocate for the city of Whitehall, I saw from, you know, behind you nodding and saying amen. And so I appreciate this voice on this panel today. And I think a lot of folks were curious about what would be shared today in terms of the content itself. And I think now that we have centered that content, the voice of the victim and of course the victim advocacy piece is huge. Tell me about your work. And I know that your work within the city of technical assistance. I'll continue the question while you're getting adjusted there. But I know that the work within the city of Whitehall is innovative in a number of ways. And you and I have worked together with a number of clients. What is bubbling up for you in this moment, just hearing the conversation thus far, knowing your work, knowing the opportunities that exist. You've been in this field of work for a long time in different ways. I just wanted to give you an opportunity to share as a victim advocate what's coming up for you.
Well, thank you very much. And I am honored and humbled to be here today with all of you and in this capacity. I think what bubbles up most for me in hearing all of the dialogue is that I'm blessed that Whitehall has a model for victim advocacy that I think should be implemented everywhere. When I took this position, Michael Bivens is our Whitehall City Attorney currently. He is going to be our next mayor. And so I think you're going to see not only, you're going to see the transformation that took place in our city attorney's office move to the entire city. But we approach crimes of violence in our office from the vantage point of empowerment. I read a definition this morning that the difference between empathy and sympathy is when we have empathy, we can understand and share the feelings, circumstances, situations, issues of others. But when we have sympathy, we have relief that we do not experience those same circumstances, situations, issues. And so we approach our work, I approach my work from a position of empathy that I believe leads to empowerment for our victims and survivors. We try to identify in our office, what is the systemic problem in the situation, in the household? If we can help, if the criminal justice system can help to resolve that issue, then that household is better. So an example is if the systemic issue is that the abuser is an alcoholic and is only abusive when he or she is drinking, then if we can work to stop the drinking, then we can stop the violence in that situation. And if we approach each case in that way, and we are able to fix, for lack of a better phrase, that situation and that household, one step at a time, we are making our community better. I always tell my clients when we're walking through, and I'm privileged to be with them on their journey through the criminal justice system, that my job is not to tell you what to do. My job is to lay out all of your options, let you make the best decision for you and your situation, and then support that decision 1000%. Even if I disagree with your decision, and I will tell you if I disagree with love, but I will support your decision. Danielle talked about the myth that violence is associated with the Black and brown man, that victims, that there's a certain stereotype that victims are frail white women. I can assure you that walking in the halls of justice just here in Franklin County, that those halls are not filled with just Black big men, okay? The diversity as it relates to crime is very great. And all you have to do is walk in any hall at any one of our courthouses here locally, and you will see that that myth is not true. I can also affirm that 98% of the victims that I deal with do not want their abuser to go to jail. 98% of the time, they want that abuser to get help with whatever the issue is so that that person can be better. And so we don't see in our offices our role in seeking justice as to incarcerate. Michael Bivens was very clear that is not the answer to solving these problems. The answer is to finding out what is the systemic issue. Let's resolve that issue to the best of our ability. And then hopefully we have restored that family to a position of safety. Part of my job also is to help victims exercise their constitutional rights now here in Ohio under Marsy's Law. I know you've all heard a lot about the Marsy's Law on the news. It recently was codified, and so it's now a part of our revised code and constitution. And, one of the main components of Marsy's Law is that victims are to be kept updated and informed about the status of their cases. They are to be treated with dignity and respect throughout the process. and they are allowed to make statements to the court when there is an important decision that is being made with respect to their case. I also assist victims in getting temporary protection orders at arraignment if they choose, giving them referral sources for things that they may need in community. So if there is a housing issue, a food insecurity issue, a employment issue, we have those referral sources, and we are fortunate in Whitehall to have a diversion partner, the Derek L. Owens Group, and his executive is here, Ramaya. The Owens Group helps us to provide stabilization services for the clients that we serve. And so sometimes there are issues of violence going on, and the victim cannot leave because her elderly mother or his elderly mother is also living in the residence. And the abuser is the person who is paying the rent. Everything is in that person's name. So they can't leave and leave their loved one behind. And so we have the ability to work with our diversion partner to help to solve that problem, so that if the victim does intend to leave or want to leave, that he or she can do so safely. So it's very encouraging. I am very thrilled to know that I am working in an environment where I feel like we are doing it right. We're doing it better because, again, our prosecutors, they have the same vision and understanding about what justice looks like. They are not, I tell my clients all the time, our job is not to lock up your loved one and throw away the key. We know that that's not going to solve the problem. Both of my prosecutors listen very intently to what our victims and survivors have to say about how they would like to see the case resolved. And like I said, 98% of the time, it's not, I want that person to go to jail and spend the rest of their life there. It's that I want this person to get help, because, you know, we have to understand that even though victims have been traumatized by someone, they still love that person. Intimate partner violence is very complicated, okay? Because this emotion that I have on top of my head is involved, okay? And it's very difficult, you know, to love someone. This person is harming you. You don't want that person, you want that person to be better. You know, it takes a lot of courage to contact law enforcement and get them involved in such an intimate and personal situation. And so we see our role as being supportive, being informative, but then also being empowering, and let this individual make the best decisions for themselves, support that decision, but while also seeking justice and doing everything that we possibly can to help them remain safe within the confines of what's available. So I thank you again very much for being here. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. So Rena, we'll go to you next. First and foremost, congratulations on your recent appointment to the Director of the Office of Violence Prevention.
Thank you.
So I'm going to ask a couple questions with both your current hat as well as your previous role as a public defender for a number of years. And I'm curious, as you are forming your office, as you were getting to know the landscape, the individuals out there doing great work, your justice professionals, many of whom are here today, where do you see opportunities throughout the justice system to really do innovation as we think about violence prevention at a more systemic level?
Sure. So thank you everyone for having us here. Like my co-panelists, I'm also very honored to be here, and I will apologize for my stuffy voice. Although I'm born and raised in Ohio, my allergies haven't caught up. So this weather change is kind of killing me. Thank you, Zach, for that. I was very recently appointed to be the executive director of the new Columbus Office of Violence Prevention. We're really excited to start that. It'll be the first in Ohio, one of about 20 to 30 across the country. And so in the last few months, while I've been working with Columbus Public Health, as well as the mayor's office, to try to figure out how exactly we wanted to fashion this office to best serve what Columbus needs. We've been speaking to other offices of violence prevention across the country and doing a deep dive into what exactly we offer here in the Columbus area for our residents as far as violence prevention goes, our programming, our resources that we're providing. And so Mayor Ginther back in early 2022 tasked Columbus Public Health to do a deep dive into gun violence as a public health crisis here in Columbus. And what they found after a number of months of research is that Here in Central Ohio, we actually offer some of the top tier programming that you can expect when it comes to violence prevention efforts, some of the best resources that we can provide to our residents. And we're also employing some of the best practices that are recommended for anti-violence programming across the country. But what we were lacking was that coordination piece. There's a recognition that here in Columbus, I mean, and a lot of the professionals are sitting here in the audience today or online, is that we have so many people in Central Ohio who care about this, who care about restorative practices, who care about providing our residents with better resources so that they don't turn to a life of violence or crime. But that coordination piece to make sure that all voices are being brought to the table, that everyone is being heard, and that we're strategizing and aligning all of our efforts, because at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We're all working towards that violence prevention, the reduction in violent crime, the reduction in crime in general. But we're being duplicative in some areas. We are maybe missing resources in others. Parts of our city, parts of Central Ohio aren't receiving the resources that particular area might need, while on the other side of the city, you might have 2 or 3 groups doing the same work. And so what our goal in the Office of Violence Prevention, and right back there, my Deputy Director, Joanne Lunsford, is sitting. So if anybody has any questions or has any feedback, feel free to talk to either of us. But what our goal is going to be to serve that as that hub. So we will first and foremost be taking a look at all of our internal city programming, what our departments are offering as far as anti-violence programming. And then we'll be working with all of our community partners and having community outreach workers who can really bring everybody's voice to the table and see how we can be in this all together. So we're really excited to take on that work. It is going to be a lot. We will be doing a lot of research and building an inventory of exactly what we are offering, because we know it's a lot and it's really great resources that are being offered. It's just, how can we make sure people know about it? People are taking advantage of it to the best of their abilities. And how can we make things better?
Yeah, thank you. We often lament in the reentry space that we are very rich in resources. It's just sometimes that infrastructure and that network can be a challenge. In a number of ways. I'm curious, as a follow-up, thinking about your time as a public defender and thinking about, clients and thinking about what Danielle has shared about, we have baked into the quote solution the exact cause of the violence to begin with. How does that resonate with you, both thinking back on, clients who you may call to mind occasionally, as well as forming this work for your office to really get involved in some of those court and justice innovation pieces?
Well, I can say that this whole side of my notebook pages, I wrote down quotes of Danielle's while she was speaking. And I'm very excited to read the book, because I do think a lot of it is just perfectly in line with what we want to be doing with the Office of Violence Prevention. But like I said, really our focus is that resource piece, hoping to provide those resources, or at least coordinate with those who are providing those resources, to divert people either from a choice of crime or choice of violence, or a further choice of crime or further choice of violence if they have offended in the first place. Like Zach said, I was a Franklin County public defender for about 10, 12 years prior to taking on my role as in-house counsel and now director of the Office of Violence Prevention with the mayor. And in that time, I handled thousands upon thousands of cases, ranging from traffic offenses all the way up to murder cases. And so the anecdotes are, never ending as far as how they can be applied to this conversation. But what really struck me was a quote that Danielle said, is that punishment is passive and accountability is active. How do you do sorry? And that really made me think about the pace of our justice system, not just here in Franklin County, but all over the place. COVID had a significant impact in the pace in which things are being processed. And when you're talking specifically about felony cases, in which I spent the majority of my career as a public defender, sometimes my former clients would be facing charges that were from instances multiple years old. So we're talking 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. A lot of times those people had completely changed, right? They were doing the sorry. They understood the harm that they had caused, and they had completely changed their lives. And sometimes the punishment was that punitive part that didn't recognize that they had already done that sorry. And so having them be sent away to prison or having them have these very stringent probationary terms placed upon them, just, in my opinion, destabilized them further and put them in a place where they were more likely to reoffend, maybe than less likely. And that's certainly not the case across the board for everybody. I can't say that could be applied to every single one of my cases, because I do think here in Franklin County, we're very lucky to have the benches that we do across all of our courts, and the court staff and the court personnel that we do. Because when we take a look at Franklin County, we are offering programs here in the city with the city attorney's office, as well as the county courts and the county prosecutor's office, probation, you name it. We're offering resources here that are just not offered in many other places in the state, let alone the nation. And so I do want to point that out, that our courts are doing a phenomenal job with that resource provision. I would have clients, again, another anecdote, where they would live in parts of Columbus or parts of Franklin County that would border another county. And so they may pick up a charge in Franklin County on one side of the street, but then they go to the other side of Polaris and pick up a shoplifting charge, let's say, and it would be in Delaware County or Fairfield County, any of the neighboring ones. And the disparity in resource provision from Franklin County to some of those other counties, and the disparity in sentencing, whereas that client here may be given the opportunity to take part in resources or a diversionary program or a probation to get them the resources they need, mental health treatment, drug addiction treatment, you name it, housing stability, financial resources, but then none of it really mattered, because the charge that they were getting in the other county was going to result in an 18, 24, 36-month prison sentence that was completely going to eradicate what the court system here in Franklin County was trying to do. So I certainly think there are a number of ways that we could be improving here, but I don't want that to take credit away from the great work that the people here in Franklin County and Columbus are doing. Like I said, I think we're blessed to have a criminal justice system overall here that recognizes this restorative piece. But certainly we're not perfect. We want to continue working at it. And that's the goal of the Office of Violence Prevention here, is to help offer these resources and these programs before anybody has to even get there.
Thank you. We want to take a few moments and offer some time for questions or thoughts from those attending either in person or online. If you have a comment or a question that you'd like to offer up briefly, please feel free to do so. For those of you in person, just throw your hand up and Reba will bring you the mic. I do have one question online while Reba's making her way over to Judge Paley. This is from Dr. Terrence Hinton, who works with the Ohio State University. He asks and says, thank you for talking about what is such an important topic. What are your thoughts on the prison system in countries like Norway? While I don't agree, and this is to you, Danielle, I apologize. While I don't agree with everything they do, I think their prison system is more effective at addressing many of these challenges as opposed to how our current criminal justice system here is in the United States.
Thank you for it. So Norway is a racially and culturally homogenous country with an incredibly robust social service infrastructure, and fundamentally different underlying values about what to do about harm, with far lower violence, like rates of violence, fewer guns, a far less robust history of participation in enslavement and colonization than we have. And so, of course, our prisons should not be the bastions of torture that they are, right? And anything we do to make them less torturous is better. Norway also has a comparably tiny number of people in prison. And so I admit there's so much love for Norwegian prisons, there's so much love for them. And I think insufficient curiosity about the surrounding cultural conditions that make those prisons possible, palatable, preferable. I will say, just as I'm not interested mostly. I'm interested in the improvement of conditions for incarcerated people, but I'm not interested in cutting edge prisons. I'm interested in cutting edge freedom. And I will always put my own labor behind that. But I think the interesting question when we look at other countries is like, what does it look like to commit to a robust social service infrastructure? What would that mean? How would we think about prisons if they weren't an extension of racialized control, right? And how does our unwillingness to build prisons in the way we see them in other places reveal and reflect to us what their actual purpose is, right? Like we know how to make prisons less degrading. We continuously don't choose it. Like for 2.5 million people every day, we don't choose to make them less degrading. That's not what we're electing. We have chosen us to perpetuate, since and through colonization and slavery, a racialized system of separation, control, punishment, and degradation. That's what we're doing. And so the question for us is, do we want to do that or not? And then there are architectural questions that follow from it, surely. But I think I think the appeal of those kinds of models can be really distracting from the fundamental questions that underpin the decisions we make about how our prisons look and feel and behave. And so I said to someone recently, I get invited to visit Norwegian prisons all the time. And I'm just like, I can't even go do the family share at my child's chipmunks class. Like I'm definitely going there before I'm going to Norwegian prison. And I was like, if you'll commit to an understanding that in each state, no more than 50 people actually need to be locked up, like actually need to be in prisons and separated in this way, that we could have the vast majority of people we've incarcerated could be free. Like if we can get down, even if we get down 100 people per state, I'll go to your Norwegian prison, and check it out at that stage. But we're not building anything like that at a scale of $2.5 million. It's not realistic. It's not a thing. It's not remotely within the scope of any realistic budget, policy, culture change, nothing. And so for me, the question is like, what does it look like if our primary question is like, what are our prisons doing? Do we want to keep doing that? Could we become a nation that does something different? And I think like the day I was born, by my best estimates, 443,850 people were locked up in the US. I was once with beloved like sociologist and scholar Todd Clear, and he guessed not just my birth year, but my birth month from that number. So if you're someone who knows that data that well, please keep my age to yourself. But if you were to stand up now and say, I think there should only be 443,850 people locked up in the US, they think you were crazy, right? Like almost none of the proposals on the table for the reduction of our prison system get even to that point. And that is a point that we have been at in a great many of our lifetimes, right? And what has changed is not that there is more crime. What has changed is that we've made a series of policy decisions that criminalize more things more harshly, so that put more people in prison in the first place, make it harder for people to come out, hold people in longer, right? We've just made a series of policy decisions. And if we were to restore our policies to what they were before that and make all of those things retroactive, we would return to a number close to that just through that decision, not through any reduction in violence, any change in any of these other things we're talking about. And so I think we have to continuously return to the reality that our country has elected to do this thing in this brutal way, in a way no other nation in human history has, and to constantly like bring our curiosity back to that and to what it will change, what it will take for us to change that question. And then when we change that, we can change everything. We can change architecture, we can change everything. But I think, and I also really highly recommend the work of Deanna Van Buren. She has an amazing TED Talk. She is an abolitionist architect. And she's like, what if instead of thinking about how we could build new prisons, what if we think about what we would build physically, like the actual buildings? She's an architect. Like, what would we build for this new world that we want to create? And so I also think her work is an incredible intervention for our imagination that is otherwise like so hard for us to access.
Thank you. Judge Paley.
First of all, I want to thank the panel for their thoughtfulness, and I agree with all of them. And I think that with all the emotions in this room right now, I can say that Franklin County is in a bubble. We are doing all of the right things. You have an awesome mayor who believes in the justice system and restorative justice, as well as Michael Bivens in Whitehall. This didn't happen overnight. And as far as how many people are in jail, I will tell you that when COVID happened, our main goal was to get people out of jail because COVID was rampant in the jails. So we were dumping people out of jail, for whatever reason. The good news is it's staying that way. That because we had to get them out of jail for health reasons for everyone, we had to figure out how to keep the community safe. And in doing so, that has continued. I will tell you that in Franklin County Municipal Court, not only do we have services for people that are defendants and victims, because we have a lot of those, we have services for people that are walking down the street. So we have one of the largest resource centers in the country in our Franklin County Municipal Court that is available to everyone, that helps with not only drug addiction, mental health addiction, but finding housing and good jobs. And I agree that jobs are critically important as well as housing. If we could fix that problem, we could fix a lot of it. But I mean, I could talk forever. We have we have our flyers for the March program out in the hall if anybody's interested. Our full resource center at the court. But I just flew over here because Mr. Ruppel asked me to, from the Woman of Achievement. And I just wanted to say this, because this just shows you what kind of community we have. Did anybody recognize who this person is? Right. She was just recognized today, Patrice Palmer, as a Woman of Achievement in Columbus, Ohio. Now, if that doesn't say something about what we are trying to do, and the reason is because she has worked very hard on reentry, because she spent a lot of time in prison. And when she got out, she became a doctor in sociology. And her whole goal is to help people that get out of prison and find their way. And the one other thing is I want to say that Lorena said, 98% of victims don't want people to go to jail, and neither do we, the judges, contrary to popular belief. And with the people like Lorena who come to us and say, here's the problem in the household, we are going to work on not putting them in jail. However, addiction is a very scary thing right now. And if it takes me a couple weeks or 30 days to get somebody clean enough to get into a program, that's when I think jail is appropriate. Other than that, I don't put people in jail. I give up basically, and then we try again. And then they come back, and then I try again. But we are working really hard. Our court system appreciates the trust that the community has in us. And if you have anything that you need, feel free to come down and visit. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you, Judge. So we are nearly at the end of our time together. It has been an incredible, provocative, challenging conversation. And I want to give Danielle the last word. And then Bishop, if I could ask you to offer us a benediction as we leave from this place. Before I hand it over to Danielle, I just wanted to read an excerpt from one of the last chapters of her book. The future healing promises is always related to the past in which it begins. Any road to a world in which violence is no longer normal, in which compassion and dignity and love define us instead, will therefore require steering head on into the damage wrought by racism and the violence from which it originates, on which it relies and which it protects. Whether or not we are up to that challenge may well be the central question of our generation. I am persuaded that it is, at the minimum, the question on which our ability to end both mass incarceration and violence depends. Danielle, do you have any parting words for us? Again, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. I want to offer my enormous gratitude and respect to all of you, to the folks who have convened it, to all of your wisdom on the panel and in the room. And, we will all be realistic. We're realists. We do work. We figure out what work is possible in a given moment, a given context, a given time. But I think one of the things that's so important is that we always make space to make sure that we are imagining the maximum of what is possible and not underestimating how much or how quickly or how many of us could get to that in our lifetimes, in this year, in this month. That sometimes far more is available and attainable to us than we give ourselves credit for, especially when we turn to one another and see how many of us share that vision and that desire and that commitment. And so I hope everybody, as until we have a system where we are confident that we are honoring the dignity of everyone who causes harm and everyone who has been hurt every time, we're not done. And so I hope that you continue to have spaces that allow for your broadest and most righteous imagination as you bring this new world forward.
Thank you. Please help me thank Danielle for her time. As you are leaving, and I will remind folks this if you've not done so, I encourage you to take a moment to grab a copy of Until We Reckon. There is an opportunity in the coming week to do some further conversation around the topics in the book, both virtually and in person. You'll find that information on the half sheets of paper on your way out. And again, we encourage you to hang around, have a cup of coffee, fellowship, and let's get to work. I will turn the floor back over to the bishop. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Let's thank this panel. Yeah. Any logistical words we need okay. Thank you, Reba. Thank you. Would you receive this blessing? May the God of hope fill you with all joy and peace in believing, so that you may overflow with hope by the power of the Holy Spirit. Amen.
Thank you.